Scottish emigration.
Fantastic. Well, I've heard your presentation when you were in Chicago and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's given us all lots to think about, and your presentation still resonates with us in Chicago to this day. So I know that we're all eager to hear you today in Detroit and online across the Scottish community. So can I hand over to you to talk to us, Professor Marjorie Harper?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So I have 20 minutes, is that correct? 20 minute slot. Okay, well, hello everybody. I'm really pleased to be talking to you. It's quite a new experience for me to be talking across Skype to an audience. It would be nice if I could be there with you in Detroit, but I hope everybody can hear what I'm saying and will be able to see the presentation. So I think without more ado, we'll just call up the first slide if we could. That slide about to appear. At the moment, you can just see. Can you see the slide? If you can see the slide, nod at me, and if you can't, shake your head. Or the screen has frozen. I can see myself.
Marjorie, we can see your presentation. We can also see you on another screen, so we are lucky on two counts.
Okay, I can't actually see my presentation, so I'll have to guess what I'm going to be speaking about. I was going to use my PowerPoint as prompt, but I'll maybe have to just look at a bit of paper instead. So at the moment you can see an introductory slide, can you? That says something like
snapshots from the Scottish migration album.
Okay. Right. Could we go on to the next slide then, please? That's just an introductory slide. The next slide up?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So it should say, why did Scots emigrate?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Okay. Again, as I say, I don't have the PowerPoint itself. So if I went, actually, I'm going to go on to my PowerPoint. Can you still see me?
Yes.
And you can still see the shot. Okay, well, I've got up on my computer now the actual PowerPoint, so I just was a bit worried that might take the. I can see that small screen in the corner. Okay, so the route map for today is I want to look a little bit at why Scots emigrated, why they then emigrated to the United States, look a little bit at their settlement patterns and behaviours, say a little bit about heritage and culture and genealogical tourism, a word or two about sources, because I think a lot of you will be interested in how to find out more about your Scots ancestors, and then maybe at the end mention the Scottish Heritage Programme, which I coordinate at the University of Aberdeen. So is that the, you've got a slide that says at the moment, why did Scots emigrate? Have you got one that says route map?
It says route map, and then a bullet point says, why did Scots emigrate?
Okay. Can we go on to the next slide then, please?
This one says, why did Scots emigrate?
Okay, so just to unpack those 5 bullet points a little bit. Scots had always had a wanderlust. I mean, since medieval times, they'd gone to Europe. They had gone as peddlers and soldiers and scholars and mercenary soldiers. But their eyes began to turn westwards after 1707, after the Parliamentary Union made it legal to trade with and settle in what were then the American colonies. So the impact of the 1707 Union was incredibly important. It turned Scottish eyes westwards. And there were various reasons for Scots going across the Atlantic. Some of them were negative reasons. You'll see in the 3rd bullet point there, it said banishment, Jacobitism and kidnap. Well, there was a traditional method of punishment in Scotland, which was to banish people not only from the parish, but to banish them overseas. And colonies like Virginia and Georgia in the pre-revolutionary period were recipients of Scots who had been banished overseas because of criminal convictions. Then in the 18th century, as a consequence of the Jacobite rebellions and the defeat of the Jacobites in those rebellions, around 600 Jacobite prisoners were transported to the American colonies after the two major rebellions, the 1715 rebellion and the 1745-6 rebellion. And most of them were sent to the Cape Fear River area of North Carolina. So fairly small numbers, but it joined a small nucleus of really Highland settlers who were already in that location. Then, third point under banishment, Jacobitism, and kidnap was this rather extraordinary mechanism of getting Scots overseas, which was a way that some municipalities, or Aberdeen in particular, as it turned out, saw a way to relieve pauperism in their communities by having people kidnapped off the streets and transported across the Atlantic. And one particular example of this, it's actually a very famous example, because the victim ultimately came back to Scotland, wrote a book about what had happened to him, and sued the people who had it done to him. And you've maybe heard of this example, was Peter Williamson, who was a 12-year-old boy, came into Aberdeen to visit his aunt, happened to be down playing on the quayside, and was kidnapped, put on board a ship, and transported out across the Atlantic, was disembarked at Philadelphia, and was then indentured to a farmer in that area. After various adventures, he participated in what we call the 7 Years' War, but we call the French Indian Wars, and was wounded, and eventually found his way back to Scotland, wrote this book, and sued the magistrates of Aberdeen for having had him kidnapped in the first place. There's a book called The Life and Curious Adventures of Peter Williamson. So those were some of the examples of people who were sent across the Atlantic to what became the United States under duress, not of their own volition. The fourth bullet point there says socioeconomic push and pull in the 18th century. What I mean there is there were various factors that pushed people out of Scotland and also simultaneously attracted them to overseas locations, particularly in North America. The push factors were generally to do with the economic climate, and particularly at that era in the Highlands, where particularly from about 1767, 1770, the economy was deteriorating. There were years of dearth, years of famine. There was cattle disease. The cattle prices dropped. In fact, everybody will have heard of Flora MacDonald. Well, one reason why Flora MacDonald and her husband emigrated to North Carolina was because they had lost 300 head of cattle from Skye, where they lived in the 3 years before they emigrated. And they just felt that things were not going to improve back at home. So there was a lack of food. There was, it wasn't famine. It wasn't that people were actually on their uppers at that point, but they feared becoming destitute. Yes, when we get to the 19th century, there were a number of Highlanders who were absolutely destitute. In the 18th century, it was more the fear of becoming destitute that propelled people across the Atlantic. And at the same time, they saw opportunities to do better for themselves as a result of letters and information in newspapers, information that was coming back across to them in Scotland. So you always have this interaction of push and pull of the things that are driving people away, the things that are attracting them overseas. And unless you were a Jacobite prisoner or a criminal or somebody who was kidnapped, there's always that element of positive and negative in the decision to go. The balance might change depending on economic and social circumstances, but there's always that element of choice. So there was an economic push at the time. There was, but more important than that, especially in the Highlands, was the social changes that were taking place, the very dislocating social changes. Because I do a couple of hours to explain this. I'll find it very briefly. Highland society was undergoing major cultural changes in the 18th century, partly as a consequence of the Jacobite rebellion and the defeat of Jacobitism. But the traditional society was being undermined, and people in the Highlands many people were very uncomfortable with that, and they chose to emigrate, to vote with their feet, to get across the Atlantic in the hope that on your side of the Atlantic they could reconstitute the kind of society that they felt was being eroded at home. So at the same time as they felt they were being pushed out from home, they saw in the colonies, the American colonies, the opportunity to reconstitute the traditional Highland society from which chieftains and clansmen were disappearing, that they would be they would be able to reconstitute it in the traditional way. And the other sort of pull factors were things like letters coming home saying, out here we have no trouble earning our bread, we have no trouble putting food on the table, and so there was a sense that life was better, it wouldn't be such a struggle across the Atlantic. And the final bullet point there, I think everybody will have heard of Samuel Johnson, the lexicographer, and his biographer, James Boswell. And they toured the Highlands and the Hebrides in 1773, and both of them wrote a book or journal about their travels. And they visited Skye, and Boswell, or they both talked, in fact, about the dance called America. And this was meant to represent how the fever for emigrating got hold of a whole district, and for everybody, as they described it, was set afloat. And it actually became easier to go than it did to stay. And people who were left behind, that the board to go or the ships were full, were, Johnson and Boswell said, absolutely distraught that they couldn't go. So there was this sense of precedent, the sense that there was already a nucleus of Scottish settlers out in America, and this was a great incentive to join them and increase the size of that nucleus. So that's why Scots emigrated. I could say a lot more about that, but I'm looking at my watch and I see I've only got about 10 minutes left or 15 minutes left. So let's move on to the next slide, if I could. Have you got that one up? I should say, why do Scots emigrate to the USA?
Yes.
Okay, well, now we're moving on to the post-revolution era. Now, in that era, the Scots who emigrated were to the United States were swimming against the tide of advice. I should have said when I was talking about the previous slide that one key way in which the eastern seaboard, what became the United States, was settled was by indentured emigration, and many Scots took part in indentured emigration. And that's a different way of settlement, pattern of settlement from the way the Scots settled in Canada. Indentured emigration was like a type of extended apprenticeship, and many of the Scots did settle in places like the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, as indentured settlers. So that had pretty well come to an end by the end of the 18th century. And by the early 19th century, indeed, well, as soon as the War of Independence was over, the publicity that was generated by governments and newspapers and commentators was all anti-New Republic. So those Scots who emigrated to the United States were, as I say, swimming against the tide of advice. And the sort of advice that was being given was, you don't want to go to a place that's rebelled, you don't want to go to this dangerous republic, you want to go to the part of the world that remained within the imperial family. So that's the second bullet point there, really, that the publicity was promoting the imperial family, go to the Canadas. The subtext there was the idea that if Scots settled what remained of the frontier, the British-American frontier, they would provide a buffer against American encroachment, because there was this fear that American new United States was going to extend its boundary northward. So there's this idea of settling the frontier. But of course, third point, the messages were very mixed, because at the same time as the government and newspapers and commentators were saying, no, don't come out to this dangerous new republic, the messages that were coming back in correspondence from those who had gone were saying, this is a land of milk and honey, this is a wonderful land, and actually promoting the idea of a republic. You will have no landlords, you will have no tithe, no taxes, you'll be able to pretty well to do as you like. So there was all this encouragement in personal correspondence at the same time as the government was saying, no, don't go there. In terms of actual numbers, what we now call Canada remained the favourite destination of the Scots right up until 1847. For the British Isles as a whole, the United States became the prominent destination in 1832 and remained so until the beginning of the 20th century, about 1909. But with the Scots, it was 1847 before they switched their allegiance, or before the pendulum swung from Canada to the United States. And then the United States did continue to take the vast numbers, the main number of Scots, until about 1909. The final, what have I got on the pictures you've got there? Just to explain why I've got those pictures. The so that all the publicity was saying, come to Canada, rather than the United States. And that continued right through into the early 20th century. That picture on the left is the railway company and the Canadian kind of promoting settlement on the prairies. This is right at the end of the 19th century, because the Canadians were very worried about the porous border and about people who'd settled in the Canadian prairies moving south to the United States, and people from the United States moving north to the prairies, and the prairies being kind of by default taken over as American areas. The picture on the right is just to I might not. Well, I'll just say briefly what it was. In 1923, there were 600 people left the Outer Hebrides in a single week, and that was quite extraordinary. And they were actually going to Canada on two ships. This particular picture, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but it shows you the quayside of Stornoway in Lewis. And it definitely shows you that emigration wasn't something that people weren't interested in. That's the crowd that saw the emigrants off when they left. 300 of them from Stornoway. In the same week, another 300 from Loch Boisden and the Isle of South Uist. And the South Uist people going to Alberta, the Lewis people going to Toronto. The point I was going to make was that many of those people who went out, particularly on the Metagama from Lewis, ultimately crossed the Great Lakes, crossed the border, and entered the United States as illegal immigrants. And that picture in the middle of Statue of Liberty with the big stop sign was, the reason they went to Canada was because many of them couldn't get into the States under the quota system in the 20s. So the way they did it was to kind of do it through the back door by going to Canada and then crossing over the lakes. Now, the fourth bullet point there, as we move on, is the point about personal persuasion. It was all very well to get to read things in newspapers and see pamphlets, and of course the part of the United States were putting out publicity about their attributes, but it was personal persuasion in letters and from individuals that really counted. And this is where I want to move on to the next slide, which I think is just a picture at the moment. I think hope you've got it there, and it should say Agnes Laurie. And Agnes Laurie pictured on the left there, and in 1930, and on the right, 3 weeks before her 101st birthday. And that's when I interviewed her, 3 weeks before her 101st birthday, and she was so enthusiastic about the time she had spent in New York in the 1930s. And I'm going to come back a little bit later on to let you hear something of her experience. But she went because she was from southwest of Scotland, from near the English border. She was in domestic service, and she had a friend who had cousins in Connecticut. And these cousins had written home to their cousin in Scotland and said, "Why don't you come to America? We can't understand why you're working for such a pittance of a wage actually it's in Liverpool, which moved across from England. Why don't you come out here?" So this friend, Gladys, and Agnes Laurie, both put their names on the waiting list so they could get onto the quota, and they emigrated in 1930. We'll come back to Agnes a little bit later on, but the point there is that she really was persuaded by a friend, by the encouragement of a friend. Now, the next slide, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it before we see it, because when we see it, I think it's automatically going to play an excerpt from another interviewee, a lady called Annie Matheson, who became Annie McRitchie a year after she landed in Detroit, came to Detroit in 1953. And I wanted to include her partly because she is in Detroit. She's still in Detroit. I mean, for all I know, she might be in the audience today. It might be wonderful if she was. But I met Annie at a conference in Paris, the Isle of Paris, a few years ago. I interviewed her first over the phone and then met her in Stornoway, where she would come to visit her sister-in-law every year. Now, Annie Matheson emigrated to Detroit in the 1950s because she grew up in a small village in the Isle of Lewis, and she said she knew so much about the United States growing up because so many people from that very small community had emigrated to the States. So rather than me explain, let's actually hear what she has to say.
I never wanted to leave Lewis except unless I would go to America. I didn't want to go to Glasgow or London to work. I'd rather stay here and look at America and stuff. Oh, everything was better than I could ever imagine. I can't think of anything that was I thought the American accent was so lovely.
And I wanted you to hear Annie. I mean, her final point is, I thought the American accent was so lovely, but I don't know if you would agree with me that she hasn't picked it up. She has been in Detroit since 1953, but to me, to my ear, she sounds as if she's still off the boat, just off the boat from Lewis. And we'll come back to, I think we'll come back to Annie a little bit later on, or maybe, oh yes, we're going to hear another comment from Annie now, because I'm going to move on, and I'm very aware that time is moving on. Move on to first impressions. We've looked at why Scots emigrated, looked at why they went to the United States, it's all to do with the Western. But I want to hear the next one. Issues.
Arrived in New York Saturday evening, early evening. There were the 4 tugs came to pull the boat. It couldn't get into the Barre Vermont, so there was 4 tugs pulling it in. But what I can never forget is the bridge. I don't know, it would be the Brooklyn Bridge with all those cars, every colour under the sun. And I was used to seeing just black or grey cars.
Now that's another interesting point that Annie makes, and I've made this point in the recent book I've done, Testimonies of Transition, which just talks about the diaspora and uses about 100 quotes from about 100 of my interviewees. And in the 1950s, many interviewees were really disillusioned with life in the UK and not least in Scotland. And they talked about how drab everything was, the clothes were drab, the people were drab, the weather was drab, and grey was the word that came out most frequently. The other thing that Annie talked about was the abundance of food on the boat. Because, of course, after the war, during the war and after the war, Britain was subject to rationing. And rationing continued until 1954. So when Annie got on this boat, this liner across the Atlantic, she said, we saw food like we've never seen in our lives before. It was apples and oranges and all these things that she'd never seen growing up. And she said the clothing was so much better when she got to America because they were on rations, coupons for clothing. The wages were so much better. And she got off the boat in New York. She was so struck by how colourful everything was. Her fiancé met her, and they took the train to Detroit. And she said it was just like being first class. She said we weren't travelling first class, but it was like first class would be in the UK. So I'll come back to Annie very, very briefly towards the end, because she went into domestic service in Detroit, and she had an interesting comment to make about that. But let's move on to the next slide. How am I doing? We've got maybe five minutes or so. And it should say settlement patterns and behaviours, a selection. Well, I could spend days talking about settlement patterns and behaviours of people, of Scots who went to America. But I thought I would just hit on 4 of them and speak very briefly about these. Way back in the 18th century, one way that the Scots became very aware of opportunities in what became the United States, but at that time the American colonies, was through the colonial tobacco trade. And this was very much linked with the city of Glasgow. I mean, the rise of Glasgow as the second city of the empire was really based on the 1707 Union and the way that union opened up opportunities for trading with America. And a big element of that trade was the colonial tobacco trade. And in Virginia in particular, I think there were 50 firms with Scottish factors or Scottish managers. And most of those who were employed, about 2,000 people who were employed in the tobacco trade in Virginia in the mid-18th century, were Scots. And the way that there was this interrelationship developed was that the tobacco was sent back to Scotland, and as part payment, then the manufactured goods would be sent out from Scotland. So a two-way trade developed, and that was a different way of organising the trade from the way it was done in England. That's a kind of 18th century element or manifestation of settlement patterns. I should maybe mention it's not one of the bullet points, but another very prominent way in which Scots settled in America in the 18th century was they came in as a kind of colonial elite. After the Union, those who were scrabbling for the best jobs tried to get those jobs in London, in England. And those who didn't manage to get a job in England very often found jobs as colonial administrators, governors, lieutenant governors in the American colonies. And I think there were about, in the first half of the 18th century, about 30 governors, lieutenant governors of Scottish birth in the colony. But just to move on very briefly again to the late 19th century, we're jumping ahead a century or so, granite tradesmen, particularly from Aberdeen, I thought I'd mention the Aberdeen connection because that's where I'm based, went out particularly to New England to cut stone mainly for memorials and post-Civil War statues. I'm going to move on to the next slide now. I'll talk about remittance men and domestic service later. Those are the two other bullet points. So if we could move on just to show you some of these pictures of the Aberdeen granite masons and quarrymen. They came mainly from the city and the surrounding area where there were granite quarries all over the county. And every spring there would be an exodus of about 200 or 300 granite tradesmen across the Atlantic, mainly to the quarries and the stone yards of Barre, Vermont. That was the centre of the Aberdeen industry, and that picture there is Rock of Ages quarry in Barre. So we move on. Leave that for a minute to say a little bit about Barre. There were three ways in which they manifested their emigration. Some of them crisscrossed the Atlantic every year because they could earn such high wages in the American quarries and stone yard that they could come back to Aberdeen in the winter when the quarries and quarry closed down because of the weather, and they'd made enough money to just spend the winter in idleness, and then they would go back to the States in the spring. Now, some who were a bit more far-sighted would stay on for a few years, save up the wages, and then come back to Aberdeen and open their own stone yard in Aberdeen, and they used the contacts they'd made when they were in the States to create orders, create business for the businesses they'd established back home. And the third method that they used was to emigrate permanently to New England and then set up their own yards eventually. And then those yards would become a focus for the employment of successive waves of guys who came out from Aberdeen. So that's the story of Barre. Then if we move on to the next slide, that is what happened to the old Capitol building in Austin, Texas in the early 1880s. And if we move on to the next slide, the construction or the cutting of the stone for the new state capitol was the task of the syndicate that was employed, that was given the job of building the new capitol, employed convicts to cut the stone. The American Granite Cutters Union went on strike in protest at the use of convict labour because, of course, they weren't getting wages and it was pulling down wages for men in the union. So the syndicate had a time penalty. There was a penalty if the job wasn't finished by the set date. So they were panicking. So in 1885, they sent an agent to Aberdeen to recruit Aberdeen men to go out and cut stone because the Aberdeen men had such a good reputation for doing that. What the agent didn't tell the 100 men who gathered in a public hall in Aberdeen was that it was strike breaking. He told them that they were going to a clean job in a wonderful climate. And when they got to Austin, of course, it wasn't actually Austin, it was a place called Marble Falls, 70 miles away. They found that they were working it was May, it was 115 degrees, and they were working in no shade. Next slide, please. And it's what my surprise, only 3 of them died, and that's the memorial stone, or the inscription on the memorial that was erected for the 3 men who died by their fellow workers. And then if we go to the next picture, it's just a picture of the memorial in the cemetery at Burnett, which is near Marble Falls. Next slide is the finished Capitol building. They had been promised 2 years' work at good wages. What they were not told was that the wages would not be paid until their transatlantic fare had been clawed back for the syndicate. Also, the work ended after 18 months. And in fact, by the time it ended, as soon as they got there, their names had been circulated to branches of the American Granite Cutters Union saying they were blacklegs and they were not to be employed elsewhere in America. So they really had a pretty tough time. Very briefly, we change slide again, the 2 other bullet points that I was going to mention about experiences and behaviours in America. I wanted just to say a little bit about remittance men. I don't know if you're familiar with the term remittance men or gentlemen emigrants. These were this is the end of the 19th century again, generally the redundant products of British public schools who couldn't find a niche at home. There were 2 well, they didn't want to go into the church. They were not generally bright enough to go into the law, and not generally competent to go into the army. And those were the three main areas for getting rid of your younger sons from gentry families. It's sort of, the Downton Abbey younger son syndrome, if you like. Anyway, these men they straddled the Canadian border, and many of them were in Canada as well as the Western United States. It's mainly the West we're talking about here. Areas like states like Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and then out in Canada, it would be British Columbia and Alberta. The two guys that I've got on the screen there were, on the left, Archie Marchbanks, and on the right, his brother, Coots Marchbanks. Now, they were the younger brothers of the Marchioness of Aberdeen. And the Marchioness of Aberdeen and her husband, Lord Aberdeen, ended up having a ranch in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. Lord Aberdeen was Governor General of Canada for about 5 years in the 1890s. But Lady Aberdeen made her first trip to North America, to the United States, in 1887 to visit these two brothers who were managing ranches for their father, Archie in the Texas Panhandle and Coots in North Dakota. But neither of them were making much of a job of it, because they were the archetypal remittance men who really just wanted to play. They wanted to go out to the West with their tennis rackets and their hunting rifles and their fishing rods, and they didn't really want to buckle down to being managers of economic enterprises. I mean, the 1880s was a time when there was huge investment in cattle ranching out in the West by syndicates and individuals back in Britain, not least in Scotland. And their father, Archie and Coots' father, Lord Edward Marchbanks, had invested in a big way in these two ranches. And there's another story what happened to them. There isn't time to go into it today. But I thought I would just mention the remittance men. I could say a lot more about them, and there's been various books been written about them. Now, I think the next slide was taken. Oh no, it isn't. Let's go on to the next slide. This is what Agnes Laurie, remember Agnes, the 100-year-old, said when she was working in New York.
I went there, and then I sent my brother the address right away, and he wrote back and said, "What are you playing at? This is the 4th address you've had in 2 years. Why are you not staying in your job?" But that was me. One had to stay on duty until 10 o'clock, and you could do as you like after that because you got your key. Well, I went to more musicals and more theatre and more everything.
Well, I hope you can detect from Agnes talking to me a few years ago that even at the age of 101, she still took enormous pleasure in remembering her time in New York. Her emigration was done it was done for pleasure. She went there to have fun. Taking a job as a domestic servant was a means to an end, and her end was to be able to have enough money to have fun. And she and Gladys would walk up and down Broadway and engage in people watching. And the jobs she had were all in Long Island. And the way she described what she was doing reminded me of reading The Great Gatsby. That sort of atmosphere. She eventually came back to Scotland because on one of her trips home for a holiday, she met the man who was to become her husband. He was an engineer on one of the Anchor Line ships, and they got married in 1939. And she was going to stay out in New York for another year and earn a bit more money, but of course the war intervened, and she came back in a convoy in October 1939. Now, I think I was going to include a slide of Annie Matheson talking about her experience in domestic service in Detroit, but the quote was too long, so I think we've actually omitted that slide. But I'll just tell you a little bit very briefly about Annie, because what she did was she came to Detroit in 1953, and she went to work for the Studebaker-Packard family, the car people, and she said she had an amazing time. She learned so much about American customs and ways of cooking and setting tables and just life in general. She said if she hadn't lived with that American family, she wouldn't have learned those sort of things. And she said she remembered Henry Ford coming for dinner, and Henry Ford's wife, she said, be like a China doll. She'd never seen anybody as much like a China doll as Henry Ford's wife. So Annie did that for a year, and then she got married, and she's been, as I say, in Detroit ever since. And the man she married was somebody who also came from Lewis, and he worked on who worked in the car factories. People who came from Lewis to Detroit either worked in the car factories or on the Great Lakes. Now, I think the next slide I'm going to show you, before we move on to it, I just want to check if it is the right one. Yeah, just before we go on, I'll explain what this is. Many people who did this kind of work on the Great Lakes came back to Lewis eventually. And you're going to hear in a minute from Norman McCrae, whose father worked on the Great Lakes in the 1940s. Norman was born in Detroit in 1941. His parents had both gone out on the Metagama, that was the ship that went out from Lewis in 1923. They met in the Lewis Society of Detroit, and then they settled down in Detroit. But then Norman, when he was 6 years old, was brought back to Lewis by his mother because his father's parents were ill, so the mother had to look after the parents. Anyway, listen to Norman. Next slide, please.
Of course, the lakes froze over in the winter time, and he used to come home to Lewis round about the beginning of December, and would be home until March, when you get a telegram that the lakes were de-icing, and off he would go again for another 9 months, leaving my mother to look after my grandfather. My grandmother had died only 6 weeks after we returned to Lewis.
And the reason I've headed that slide, ships, cars and policing, is, as I said already, that the Lewis people who went out to Detroit worked in the Great Lakes or in the car industry. But Norman, when he grew up, became a policeman in Strathclyde in Glasgow. And as part of his job, he actually went out to Detroit to see how drug policing was dealt with. So he told me some interesting things about that in his interview. But time's going on, so let's move on to the next slide, which is heritage and culture. And how did the Scots demonstrate their Scottishness in America? Well, the first bullet point there is a quote from Samuel Johnson. Remember, we talked about Samuel Johnson at the beginning. And he said that when Scots emigrated across the Atlantic, they, quote, changed nothing but the place of their abode. In other words, they took with them their Scottish identity and their Scottish folkways and ways of life. We could debate that if we had more time, but we haven't. Second bullet point there is multiple identities and what are called identifications. And the reason I use those two words is I think identity is a more or a less malleable word than identifications. Identification is something that you put on and off as the circumstances dictate. And most Scots, I think, were and are people of multiple identities. They could be British when it was necessary to be British. They could be Scottish when it was necessary or in their interest to be Scottish. But they also became American. And the terms that are usually used to describe what happened, and still are to describe what happened to people, would be, did you adapt, did you integrate, or did you assimilate? And I think that which category the Scots fell into really depended on their own personalities. It depended on the type of employment they went into. It depended on the type of people with whom they associated. And that leads on to the third bullet point there, which it's a phrase which has come into vogue in the last decade or so, associational culture. And all I really mean there is Scots associating with each other in various ways. Now, in the early days of immigration and settlement, the key ways to do that, the key pillars of Scottish society overseas, would be the church and the school. There were also secular associations, of course, you'll be familiar with many of them, Burns clubs, and as the very organisation that you're involved with, St Andrews societies. So you get Burns clubs, St Andrews societies, Caledonian societies, Highland games, but then the church and the school were the kind of cementing factors within the community. In Detroit itself, of course, there was the Lewis Society, the Lewis Society of Detroit, the minute books of which have recently been repatriated to the Isle of Lewis, and I've actually seen some of them. And those societies, like the Lewis Society of Detroit, they weren't just social clubs. For example, during the Depression, the Lewis Society of Detroit raised money to repatriate people who had fallen fallen on hard times, including some people who were terminally ill and wanted to return home but couldn't afford to do so. So they did have a philanthropic function. And going right back to the 18th century, many of these societies had a philanthropic function as well. And then, of course, in terms of Scottish heritage and culture, we've got the whole huge area of genealogical tourism, which I think I've gone over my time, so I'm not going to go into now. But the picture at the bottom of the slide there is of Grandfather Mountain Highland Games in North Carolina, which was one of the things that really kicked off the interest in genealogical tourism. I think it was kicked off partly by Alex Haley's book on roots and the televised version of that. But it's something, well, actually, it goes back further than that, because in the 1920s and 30s, the Scottish American Societies were bringing across biennially to Scotland large numbers of genealogical tourists who would be visiting places of their heritage and also places of tourist interest like the Trossachs and Burns, Potter's Alloway. And that was done really, well, actually, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. But that's another story. So if we move on to the next slide, I was just going to finish by talking about roots to the roots. How do you trace your emigrant ancestors? Well, many of you will know more about this than I do because you'll have done it. But I just thought I'd mention a couple of things. The Ellis Island, well, the archive at Ellis Island, but also the oral history archive at Ellis Island, tremendous repository of material. And I've been privileged to listen to some of those interviews. And of course, we can link up the interviews with sometimes with material that we can find at this end, this end being my end. Now, I was one of the things I was going to talk about, but there isn't time to do it, was, in terms of experience, the difference between rhetoric and reality. Robert Louis Stevenson crossed the Atlantic in 1879 in pursuit of his lover, Fanny Osborne, and he landed at New York, and then he took a train across to California. And he said of his fellow passengers on the SS Livonia, there is nothing more, I've forgotten it, something like nothing more optimistic to picture and nothing more pathetic to behold. In other words, he said we were a ship full of failures. And he said they were all expecting America to be wonderful. And he said they got there, and as they were traveling west on the train, they were meeting trainloads of people coming east saying, don't go out west. Because it's not as the promotional pamphlet painted to be. And some of the people who came into Ellis Island, particularly when they were children, I remember one interviewee whom I listened to saying, we thought, we'd seen all these silent movies and we expected the streets of New York to be full of cowboys. And they weren't, and we were terribly disappointed. So, we all have our kind of stereotypes. And going back to the genealogical tourism, a lot of the genealogical tourists maybe came to Scotland thinking that there was going to be a certain image of Scotland that they were going to that was going to be reality, like Brigadoon. The famous comment about the first film Brigadoon, where the producer came to Scotland and went back to Hollywood disappointed and made Brigadoon in Hollywood, and he said, "I came to Scotland, but I could find nowhere that looked like Scotland." Anyway, Ellis Island. The other thing that the other source I was going to mention, it's a very small source, but it's something I was involved in, and it's called the Scottish Emigration Database. And sometimes you can link up people who you find in the database with people who then pass through Ellis Island. It's only about 21,000 entries because we ran out of funding to carry it on. But what it does is it gives, if you move on to the next slide, it just gives you, it's digital photographs which we've uploaded of people who emigrated really mostly in the first 4 months of 1923. And that was 1923 was the most dramatic year in the interwar period for the Scots leaving. 89,000 Scots emigrated that year. And in the 1920s as a whole, the population of Scotland dropped because of the number of people who had left. And a lot of that is to do with the post-war problem. Next slide is a highlighted version of that. And I know I'm run out of time, so I'm almost at the end. And if we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to mention, this is the commercial bit. All I've done today is, well, I know I've gone over time, but I've tried to give you an overview of the story of Scottish emigration, particularly to the United States. One of the things I'm doing at Aberdeen at the moment is coordinating something called the Scottish Heritage Programme, which is a distance learning taught master's degree, which gives people an overview of, well, it's not just Scottish history, it's Scottish heritage. It's at the moment 5 courses. We have one on Scotland's millennium, so 1,000 years of Scottish history. We have one on Scottish art history, Scottish philosophy. We have a research methodology course. But we also have a course which I teach on the Scottish diaspora, which isn't just the United States, it's the Scottish diaspora as a whole, a 12-week course. But that programme is fully online, it's flexible study. It covers Scotland's history, art history and philosophy. There's more to come. We've got a link there if you're interested in finding out more about it, and it includes the course on the Scottish diaspora. And I think that is, according to what I've got on the screen here, the last slide. So I'm going to close down my PowerPoint and just say thank you very much. And I don't know if there's time for questions when they've gone so badly over time that you have to go and have your lunch or whatever. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We might have just a couple questions from the floor, if you don't mind, and we'll try to do that. John Belisai has the mic, and are there questions? Take 2 questions.
Any questions for Professor Harper or for Derek Blunt? We have time, maybe 2, 3. Anybody? Okay. I'm going to pass the mic to this gentleman.
Can you hear me?
I think so. Yeah, carry on.
Okay. In the 18th and early 19th century, an awful lot of Scots came over and ended up in the southern U.S., where many of them were able to and did own slaves.
Yeah.
A lot of them fought on the Confederate side of the U.S. Civil War. How much of that were the people back in Scotland aware of? And was that an attraction to getting people over?
I don't think there was a huge awareness that Scots were slave owners at the time, except obviously in the within the families that owned whose emigrant members owned the slaves. Certainly, in recent years, the historiography of slave-owning Scots has become a big part of the study of the Scottish diaspora. So nowadays, there is certainly a huge awareness that this happened, not just in the southern states, but also in the Caribbean. And when slavery was abolished in the British Empire, there was a register, what's it called, a Scottish slave compensation register compiled. Now you'd think from the title that might mean it was the slaves who were compensated. It wasn't. It was the plantation owners who were given compensation for having lost their slaves. But I think at the time there was not an awareness. When the Civil War, at the time of the Civil War, there was. There's been students that have even done PhDs on this. In the newspapers, a lot of abolitionist editorial input. So I haven't made a particular study of it, but I think at that time there would have been, yes, an embarrassing awareness, but not until a lot later.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Just one more.
One more question. Burning question. Don't be intimidated. Gentleman over here. Come up here if you would, please.
Thank you. For those of us out west, and thinking San Francisco in particular, is there any interesting or much Scottish history, immigration history to be sussed out of Angel Island rather than Ellis in the east?
No, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. I'm not a genealogist, so I've never done a particular study. But I think the Scots coming in, just sheer reasons of geography. They came in through Ellis, and even then, if they were first class or second class passengers, they didn't have to even go through Ellis Island. So I'm not aware of a similar source on the West Coast. You get the West Coast settlement would be, you get that from other sources. I'm trying to think what they would be, but I'm as far as I'm aware, no.
Thank you, Dr. Harper, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.